Welcome to the show. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion of college. Ways that we can reduce the cost of college for our children, ways that parents can save a little bit of money by using the resources that are out there for financial aid. And today I just kind of want to wrap up with a general talk about assets, but first I want to cover probably the most common area of questions that I receive in the classes and the seminars that I teach on the subject. And that is, who files the FAFSA applications? Who files for these things? And generally this is a question that's coming up because there's been a divorce and there's maybe been a remarriage. So who files for that? So let me just cover this very quickly. There's a financial aid term that we use called custodial parent. And the custodial parent in the financial aid world is the person that actually files the FAFSA. They're the person that actually goes to the website, inputs their information, their assets and so forth, and the qualification is done through the expected family contribution. So this is an important issue because this is something that can work against you or for you. Because quite often in a divorce situation, especially when there's remarriage, there's an awful lot of questions about whether or not it should be the stepfather or the ex. Who is the one that provides that? And that could work for you, and that could work against you, depending on their financial situation. But so what determines the custodial parent? What determines who files the paperwork? Well, first of all, the word custodial does not mean custody. There is a relationship in answering this question for parents when it comes to custody, but it doesn't mean the same thing. It doesn't mean who has legal custody. It does not mean who is the dependent. A lot of people think whoever files for the dependent on their tax return is going to be the one who actually files the financial aid forms. That is not the case. There's one question that's asked in these types of situations to determine who files for the application. And that is, where did the student live the most the last 12 months? Where did the student live the most the last 12 months? Now that is what's going to dictate whether or not it's a step parent or a natural parent. And in the last 12 months, this is the 12-month period beginning and ending from the application date that you fill out the FAFSA, not a calendar year. So in the previous 12 months, where did the child live the most? If that child lived with the mom and the stepfather, they're the ones that fill out the application. Now, there's a second question that's involved here, and that would be in the situation that a child did not live with more than one parent than the other. Most of the time, even in a joint custody situation, they're going to live most of the time with the mom. But then the second question answers where is a support question, and this comes back to the dependent. So if you're not able to answer the question of where the student lived the most in the last 12 months, then you have to go to a tiebreaker question, which is who provided the most support in the past 12 months. And this does relate to how we file for, how we claim someone as a dependent on the tax return. So we first go and see where the child's lived the most of the time in the last 12 months. If that is more of a 50-50 situation, then we can go to who provided the most support in the last 12 months. Whoever that is answered is who files the FAFSA. That is probably the most common question that I receive from parents, not knowing what to do. And it could be something that works for you, could be something that works against you. But quite often, this is going to mean that a stepfather and a mom are going to report their income and assets. And that might be favorable, it might not be favorable for you to do that. But custodial parent means the parent who is responsible for filing. It doesn't mean custody. It means who is responsible for filing. So it really comes down to where the student lives the most in the last 12 months. Now, just as a side note, another question that I receive is also related to the educational credits that are out there. People get confused between the financial aid rules and the IRS rules for filing our taxes. And I alluded to that before as far as what a dependent. A custodial parent is not the parent that files for the dependent. Whether or not you can or cannot file for a dependent on your tax return has nothing to do with the rule. Very similarly, whoever files for the educational credit for the child may or may not be the non-custodial parent. Doesn't have anything to do with that. Quite often, most people are aware of the Hope credit and the various student credits that are out there that you can take off your taxes. That has no bearing on the situation of who files the financial aid application. So you might have one parent who's claiming a dependent and filing for a credit even though someone else is actually paying for college. And those things might matter to the IRS as far as whether you take these credits or not. But it doesn't make any difference to the financial aid rules and the FAFSA process. So I just want to get that out of the way very quickly. And for the remainder of the time, I want to focus on really the most important part of this series, and that is ways that we can increase our financial aid, ways that we can receive better situations. And we've gone through all these different rules as far as treatment of our income and assets. But I want to go further from that and talk about ways that we can plan, ways that we can rearrange our assets, ways that we can reduce the cost of college because we increase the cost of our aid. Now, I teach a class on all this, and I call it by a lot of different things. And one thing I call it by is, one way I describe it is by reducing, I tell people that I can help them reduce the cost of college by 50%. And the way that I can do that is by rearranging their assets that will allow them to take advantage of the financial aid rules, what types of assets and income are counted versus what types of assets or income that are not counted, and maximize that process. It's no different than when we fill out our tax return. We want to take full advantage of the tax laws. We don't want to pay any more taxes than we're legally obligated to. Same kind of thing here. So let's talk about these different rules as they relate to specific income and assets. And the first thing that we need to talk about is what we call the base year. And the base year is the financial aid timeline. And it's the timeline for when financial events happen, it goes into the eligibility for the FAFSA. And in past years, the base year began the junior year, January 1st of your child's junior year, and went through 12/31 of the senior year. And that was the financial aid timeline. That was the timeline of any kind of financial event, whether it was income, anything that happened during that time period would go into the financial aid FAFSA application. So now, recently they changed that. They actually went back 2 years on income. And I made the statement in one of the previous weeks that you needed to look at the financial aid process starting on October the 1st. And this is where this change comes in, because now they're looking back 2 years. So now the base year involves the sophomore year, January 1st of a child's sophomore year through 12/31 of their senior year. And they're primarily looking at income during that time period. That's a change. And that's why they're allowing people to file the application on October the 1st, as opposed to waiting until the end of the year for taxes to be done. Now, there's about 3 areas that I want to point out before the break, some areas that people make some decisions in that creates a problem for the base year. And the first area is what happens when we sell assets. And the typical scenario that I run into are people that have been saving money for college their child's entire life. They set up a college fund when they were young. They maybe put it in an index fund or a mutual fund or something that's grown over the years. And as the child gets into high school and as they get closer to college, they begin to sell those assets, which is a very smart move. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that parents make with their college savings is not doing that. They don't reduce the amount of risk, reduce the volatility associated with their investments for their child for college, and they run the risk of a 2008 type event where the market corrects. So as we all get closer, as our children get closer to college, we need to liquidate these funds, make them available, remove the risk, and so forth. So it's a very smart idea. The problem is that when you do that, you're going to pay capital gains. So if you've invested this money over a long period of time, you're typically going to have pretty large capital gains. Well, that capital gain is treated as income. That income goes into if it happens during the base year, which is pretty much when the child is in high school, it's going to go in and decrease your eligibility for financial aid. And then the second situation that we run into is where someone sells their house. Very similar situation. There's been a lot of tinkering with the taxes associated with your primary residence over the years, and currently, when you sell a house above certain thresholds of gain, you will pay taxes. So quite often, I see someone kind of in a downsizing phase, kind of getting ready for the children to go off to college. The empty nest is around the corner. They're thinking they want to get rid of the expensive house with a lot of upkeep, and they don't need the school system anymore. They want to get rid of the property taxes and so forth. It's a very smart move. Downsizing, getting ready for retirement, very, very smart move. The problem is when you sell your home, if you have a large gain, you're going to absolutely wipe out your eligibility for financial aid. And a lot of people looking at these types of situations have been living in a home, raised their children, gone through their entire life. They have a lot of equity in their home, a lot of gain in their home, and they just need to be careful about doing this. I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that you have to be careful about selling any kind of asset during the base year. So, because it will make you ineligible for financial aid. It will decrease the amount of financial aid that you can receive. And then the third area that I want to cover very quickly before the break that I get into a lot is when grandparents are involved. You know, I love grandparents. Most of us wouldn't be able to make it without grandparents. They're an awful lot of help as we speak. My one grandmother is taking our dog to the vet while I'm recording this show, and I desperately need grandparents. And a lot of parents are very much dependent upon grandparents to help financially, which is great. You know, a lot of grandparents want to help out with college. The problem is, according to the financial aid rules, when a grandparent gives money to a child, it's what we call a resource. It's considered a resource, and a resource decreases financial aid. So you may remember in previous weeks when we were talking about the student wanting to go to Auburn. If there was a financial need of $5,000 going to Auburn, and a grandparent gave that child $5,000, they now have no financial need. So this is a situation that grandparents can actually backfire by giving resources to the student. So you have to be very careful about grandparents being involved, how they help, the way they help, and we'll continue the discussion when we come back from break, because I'm running out of time, and I just want you to understand the best way that grandparents can help the grandkids. Welcome back. Let's continue our discussion of how grandparents can help. When we left off, I started talking about how grandparents are so valuable, how they help in these separate situations, how they help in general. The Wilsons could not get through life without our grandparents. Financially, though, a lot of parents are very much dependent upon their grandparents to help. But there's a certain way they need to do that and not do that. Most of the time, when we left off before the break, we were talking about resources. Because most of the time when the grandparent gives money to the child, it is going to be counted as a resource, and it's going to hurt their financial aid. Usually another situation that I see, the grandparent will give money directly to the university. And this is generally at the suggestion of their advisors. There's an estate planning reason for that. a little bit beyond the scope of this show, but what they're really what they're trying to do is reduce the size of someone's estate by allowing, because the IRS allows you to give money directly to a university and not be limited. There's an annual amount that we are able to give that's limited by the IRS, and there's an exception to that. And the exception is if you pay the university directly. So a lot of advisors will tell the grandparents, especially those with a large estate, to give that money directly to the university. The problem with that is when they do that, it's going to be considered a resource. It's going to dollar for dollar reduce their financial need, dollar for dollar reduce their aid. So how can grandparents help? Well, in general, what I tell parents is that if there is a strong need for financial aid, you need to maximize the resources that are out there. Tell the grandparents to hold on to it. Because what most likely will happen is that as they go through the financial aid process, they're going to have loans. That means they're going to have some grants, but they're also going to have loans. Let the grandparents pay off those loans after school. So let them go through the process, because the financial aid process is an annual process. Starts when before the child goes off to college, but it happens every year. Every year it looks back 2 years. So until they get to the second semester of their junior year, they're still going to be filing annual renewals for financial aid. That is the point in which a grandparent could help out. They could pay off the student loans and so forth. So that usually is, I certainly don't want to discourage any grandparent from helping, but in a situation where we need to maximize financial aid, the best situation generally is to wait until the end of college, pay off the student loans and so forth. So let's move on. I want to finish out this section today just talking about continuing a discussion of assets in general. And this is going to lead into some planning ideas that you can use to maximize the aid for your child. And what's important for you to understand is with respect to assets, what counts for financial aid? What doesn't count for financial aid? Because there is different treatment of assets. And so one of the planning maneuvers is that you move assets between these different things. Some things count, some things don't count, because that allows you to maximize the aid. The assets that you have at the time in which you apply is what the FAFSA requires. So these are planning maneuvers that you would do before you sign the application, because it's whatever assets you have at time of application. But there's several things that are going on here. One is that there's a great difference in treatment between an asset that's owned by a child versus an asset that's owned by a parent. And let me just illustrate. Suppose that you have a $40,000 asset that's owned by a child. Typically we see this. This is actually a lot of times where the grandparent comes in, they set up an UGMA, what we call UGMA. UGMA, it's a Uniform Gift to Minor. And we set up these accounts in their name. We might set up, sometimes I see grandparents giving stock to their kids every year for Christmas, grandkids every year for Christmas, something along those lines. But what happens is when you have an asset that's owned by a child, it's counted about 4 times more for the financial aid process than an asset that's owned by a parent. So if you had a $40,000 asset in a parent's name, for example, about $2,000 of that would be considered for the expected family contribution. So of $40,000, only $2,000 of it is counted towards your ability to pay for college. Now, if that asset's in the child's name, $8,000 is counted. It's 4 times as much. And the thought process is the government recognizes that an asset that a parent has isn't just only going to be used for college. They've got other reasons to use those assets, other needs. So only a portion of those assets are used for college. But in contrast, for the student, all of that money can be used for college. I mean, what else are they going to use it for? To buy games? So the first planning situation that goes on is by making sure that we remove these assets from the child's name. And we can do that by moving those assets to an excluded asset. And just hold that thought for a minute, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other problem that I run into with people filling out these applications is as far as what the value of their home is. In general, the value of your primary residence is excluded as an asset for the financial aid purposes, but some colleges will want to include it, particularly private and more expensive schools. Now, on the applications, you have to put down the fair market value of the home. That is defined as what you would sell it for today, not necessarily what you would like to sell it for, but what you could sell it for today. You know, a lot of people overstate the value of their homes on these financial aid applications and render themselves ineligible for financial aid because of that. Now, the final thing that I want to cover as far as assets is what is an excluded asset. There's basically three different categories of excluded assets. One I just mentioned, and that was the house. The other two are retirement plans and cash value insurance. Retirement plans and cash value insurance. According to the rules with the FAFSA, the value of retirement plans, IRAs, SEPs, and so forth are not included in the process. Those are excluded assets. So the value of those things do not go into the equation about whether or not you can contribute money to your child's college and so forth. Same is true for cash value insurance as well. That is an excluded asset. So it's not one of the assets that is put on the application. Now, the reason why that's important is because you have an opportunity to move assets from included assets to excluded assets by taking advantage of these retirement plans or cash value insurance. And let me preface this by saying, and I'll close out this section today with this, I really need you to listen to me very carefully. Over the years, I've run into an awful lot of people that convince parents that they need to move assets to these excluded assets so they can receive more money. And that is true. You do have the ability of moving these excluded assets to assets that are not included. The problem is that the insurance guys use this as a way to sell their insurance. So the type of asset you move it to, it needs to have a very specific characteristic. So for example, if you have a brokerage account with Fidelity, and you might have a $100,000 brokerage account with Fidelity, you can actually move that account to either a cash value insurance policy or an annuity for retirement and have that excluded. And by excluding that, you will increase the amount of aid that you would receive under the FAFSA process. The problem is that you need to do this with the right type of asset. This is not a situation that you can go to your regular insurance guy and find the right types of products to do this. The excluded assets have got to fit a certain criteria. And in general, what that's going to mean is that there's no fees, there's no commissions. Moving your assets to something that's excluded is a good idea in general, but it has to be done with the right types of products. It has to be done with the right types of insurance and annuities. They have to have the certain characteristics. They cannot be loaded, they cannot have fees, they cannot have surrender charges. And by having those three characteristics, it's going to mean that about 99.9% of companies out there are not going to be able to provide you with this type of product. It's going to have to be someone like Schwab, someone like Fidelity, someone like Vanguard, someone that's geared towards this non-loaded, no fee, low fee, no surrender charge type situation. That is the only example of products that this idea will work. If you take your assets and you move them to an excluded asset, into insurance, into annuities, into these various things, you need to be able to do it temporarily. You need to be able to move it back without cost. You need to be able to move it back without any kind of real penalty. And that is not going to exist if you go down the road to your Merrill Lynch representative. This is not the type of product there's going to be commissions paid. It's not the type of product that you're going to want to see loads. You're not going to want to see any kind of fees. You're not going to want to have any surrender charges, which are very typical for the different brokerage companies. When you move money to these types of products, you're going to have to leave it there. Those are not the situations that I want you to look at for this. It has to be a situation that you can move back and forth freely, and that's going to generally be a no-loaded situation, like you will see in like a mutual fund, a no-loaded mutual fund, where you can move back and forth. It's generally not going to have a representative involved. It's going to have to be a fee-only advisor if there is a representative involved. This is going to have to be something that you deal with them or do it directly with the companies. But it's extremely important for you to understand that, because over the years, I've heard an awful lot of insurance guys and brokers talking about this and talking about moving money away from included assets to excluded assets. And it's a good idea. The problem is they do it with the companies. There's usually a big commission involved, there's surrender charges involved, and it backfires. And it has to have these characteristics for you to look at this. It just does not make any sense otherwise unless they have these characteristics. One thing that could change is the rules could change. If you did move your assets to an annuity or an insurance, cash value insurance, they may change the rules. And you may just want to turn around and, because of that, it's not really an advantage. You may want to turn around and move it back. You need to be able to do that without any kind of disadvantage. And the disadvantage is going to be fees, loads, charges for moving it. So it has to have those characteristics, or it's just a terrible idea. And then again is going to include about 99% of the company it's going to exclude about 99% of the companies that are out there. So be careful on that. If you have further questions, feel free to call me at the office, and I'll be happy to answer anything that you have. But that pretty much wraps up this discussion of college, ways that you can decrease your cost for college. And just in a quick summary, the biggest thing you can do is select a lot of different colleges, different kinds of colleges, have a cross-section of different financial aid packages, different resources that are available to you. You can create that competition. You can negotiate with them. You can create a competition between them. And then you can also look at moving assets into excluded assets that will increase your eligibility for financial aid to begin with. And I hope that was been helpful, and this wraps up today's session.